Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled to welcome you today as we discuss the Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, a poet's journey through American slavery and independence. And before we begin today's program, we are so excited to announce a new partnership with Travelers Insurance. And we want to extend a warm welcome to all Travelers employees who are tuning in today, and we thank them for their support. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend, Ryan, who will be taking your questions. And today we are so thrilled to welcome our guest author, who is a distinguished professor of history, American studies, and Africana studies at the City University of New York's Graduate Center, and the author of Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification, and Runaway America, Benjamin Franklin's Slavery and the American Revolution. He has written for the New York Times, Book Review, Boston Review, The Atlantic, among other notable publications. Welcome, Professor. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I was wondering if you could just first off give us an overview of this work.
Well, this is a biography of an ordinary person who became the most famous enslaved and the most famous African American of the 18th century. She did that by writing poems that were circulated, published, and in Boston and elsewhere, and over a surprisingly short time, at a very young age, she became known as a prodigy and as someone who was participating in some of the most important conversations that were going on about the conversion of Africans and native peoples, about the great evangelist George Whitefield, about the events that led up to the American Revolution, and about most importantly herself and what it meant that she was doing what she was doing, and what implications that had for the future of the enslavement of Africans.
And then you begin with Whitley's journey on the ship Phillis. What do we know about her life before landing in Boston?
There is almost no evidence of where she came from and what her life was like. There is a story that a descendant of the Wheatley family, the White Wheatleys, recorded in a short memoir that prefaced an edition of her poems in the 1830s about her mother pouring out water to the sun in some sort of ritual in the morning, that she had mentioned this at one time. Besides that, what we do have are some letters that the captain of the owner of the slave ship Phillis wrote to his captain before that voyage and around that time for previous voyages, which helped to reconstruct what that actual voyage was like. And I've done a little bit more than, so I have a chapter on that. But otherwise, it's my reconstruction is based on probabilities because of what was going on in West Africa and in the slave trade in the 1750s, which was actually quite a dynamic time. In both the Atlantic and in West Africa, with a succession of wars and a ramping up of the slave trade. And so so it might seem to be that there's nothing to say, but what we do know from what was typical, what was going on, and the fact of where the Phillis went on other voyages, that it went down the coast, though he's directed to go to Senegambia, and that's a very likely place for a British slaver to go. It's entirely possible that she was picked up at other ports. She may have been from a coastal place, or she may have been from inland. She may have been pawned. She may have been sold before. She may have been the ship may have stopped in the Caribbean, but what that's so there's not a lot that's definite, but there's a lot that we can know about her that I think helps explain why she was so sensitive to cultural differences, why she's so, I think, cosmopolitan and knowing about the world, even though she's probably only about 7 or 8 years old when she arrives in Boston in 1761.
Absolutely. And who are the Wheatley? Who is the Wheatley family?
John Wheatley is a wealthy merchant and tailor. They have a pretty big house. The other main thing that's on King Street, right in the center of things in Boston, not far from the Long Wharf. That's where his house and business is. Susanna Wheatley is, they're older. They've got almost grown children who are actually these twins who were born relatively late. They had several children before that who didn't survive. So they're in their 50s and 60s by the time they're in their 50s by the time Phillis gets there, and they are evangelical. They are had been strong participants in the revivals, very active in church affairs. Susanna Wheatley is active in supporting the Mohegan minister Samson Occam and in supporting George Whitefield in his various endeavors. That's pretty much what we know about them. We don't, oddly, we know more about Phillis. We have more words from Phillis than we have from any of the white Wheatleys.
Yeah, something that's fascinating that I hadn't read a lot before is you talk about the cohort of sort of freed and enslaved Africans who were in Boston at this time, most notably Obor Tanner and Andrew Wendell. Can you tell us about that, sort of her cohort there in town?
What I noticed from paying close attention to the ships that are coming in, the advertisements for the sale and recapture of Africans, and other testimony was that these years during and after the 7 Years' War, when Phillis Wheatley came, there was a kind of a, I don't know if I want to call it a spike, a mini spike in slave imports. This makes a lot of sense because a lot of men went off to war during the 7 Years' War from Massachusetts, disproportionately. And so there's kind of a labor shortage, and that even though it's harder for ships to get through, there's also more of a market for the enslaved, and it seems especially for younger enslaved people. So what I started to notice by 1763-64 is it's quite striking that there are even though Timothy Fitch complains about how many young and female slaves came on the ship, and he wanted more older, more valuable slaves. He's the owner of the Phillis. What's apparent by the time Phillis is getting acclimated and acculturated and being noticed for these amazing skills is that she's not the only one. There are other, I call them other geniuses, other highly skilled young Africans who are making themselves extremely useful and are participating in all kinds of activities. They're doing all kinds of jobs. And this idea that only rich people had slaves and they were really only about opening the door of the carriage, as the master came in and came out and kind of showing off the wealth, that's not true at all. They're doing all kinds of work, as white young people were in Boston. This is a New England, colonial New England is a place where orphans were assigned to other families, and young people's labor was considered very valuable in a cash scarce economy, and so the actual, if not revival, continuation of African slavery in not long before the American Revolution reflected all these trends, and it wasn't going away. That these were valuable people, and what happens is that I think it's pretty clear that Phillis Wheatley has a community. She's not as alone as she's been depicted. She's not the only literate African, and so Andrew Wendell is a great example. Andrew Wendell testifies at the trial of the soldiers who shot at and killed civilians at the Boston massacre, after the Boston massacre. And he testifies what he's seen. And in the course of his being cross-examined, his master, Oliver Wendell, says, he's literate. He writes poetry, and he's really smart. And Sam Adams and others of the Patriots, they ridicule him because his testimony seems like it's going to help get the officers off. So they start criticizing him in the press, and they mock. They say, "Oh yeah, he's eloquent and he's a good writer, but like that's really only to impress the ladies. He's not really doing anything substantial." But his master says he writes poetry, so he's not. So Phillis is not the only one. I also have something that didn't make it into the book. I found a fugitive ad for in New York, where one of the rectors of Trinity Church in New York. This is a New York story, so there's no reason not to tell it here. One of the rectors of Trinity Church has an ad for his enslaved person in which he says that his enslaved person knew Latin.
Wow.
I mean, that's not supposed to be possible. We don't know how much Latin Phillis knew. Her master at one point says that she's learning it. I don't think it really matters because she's clearly reading the Greek and Roman classics in translation like everybody else is. So it doesn't really matter whether she had Greek or Latin to be very familiar with and comfortable with those texts.
We love it when we can share exclusive with our Books Breaks audience. So wanting to just to go on thinking about how she got her start in writing, because you talk a lot about the mythology about her literacy, about who taught her, and it's really fascinating. You go into that in the book. So if you could share that with us.
Probably she was taught by the women in the family. There's some contradictory testimony about it, and there's even Hannah Mather Crocker thought she remembered that she went to school with Mary Wheatley. The twins were Mary and Nathaniel Wheatley, who were 18 when she arrived. So it seems highly unlikely that she would have still been in school. It doesn't really make much sense, and she's a lot older. It's more likely that it's probably more likely that they actually enrolled her in a school we don't really know. But what's clear is that women were responsible for teaching reading in New England, and so this is really a female project, and that makes sense because it's really these networks of women who are her first audience, and often the addressee of her poems.
Yeah, and can you tell us about her first published works?
The first poem she publishes is about a shipwreck of two merchants in the whaling trade, the oil trade from Nantucket, and they have connections to the Wheatleys, and they come to dinner and they're telling their story about this storm that everybody knew about. It's reported in the paper how big this storm was, and so she the preface to the poem that appears in the newspaper says that she was waiting at table, and that she was basically serving, and she hears the story, and then she writes this poem about what must these merchants have experienced and felt like the howling winds. And she makes a lot of classical comparisons that are right out of the Aeneid and Homer. She's kind of paraphrasing and referencing these stories that readers would have known. And then she switches and she says, well, it's really, all that stuff doesn't matter. What really matters was that, you were saved by God, and this should increase your faith. So it's very conventional. Shipwreck poetry was very common in places like Boston. Ben Franklin had written his first poem, published poem was the Taking to Teach the Pirate. So this is kind of standard Boston stuff, as is the religious part of it. But what's really important about it, I think, and why it got such notice, and why it's a moment, and it's not the first poem she wrote, but it's the first one she published. Why it's such it's particularly important in her development. Why I think she wrote it was that this is where we see from a very early time her being drawn to this neoclassical literature, neoclassical form and set of references to, especially to the Odyssey and the Aeneid, which are basically stories about travelers who go on dangerous voyages and who enslave people or get enslaved, and who participate in the traffic in women, and who slaving and enslavement are a big part of the drama in these epic stories. So and so is war, and so are enslaved people as characters, sometimes as crafty characters. So I argue from the outset and throughout the book that this literature, which we think of as very distant and having nothing that would appeal to an African who's been converted to Christianity, actually this would have spoken to her, to her experience.
Yeah,
and in ways that we haven't realized. So the experience I had was, I had to get two educations. I had to learn about West African history, and I had to learn about Greek and Roman classics, which I had never studied, in order to really understand why Phillis Wheatley is in this position to do what she did, and how she does it.
Inspired your title. Can you tell us what the first reactions to her writing was, to the published work, the public at large?
Well, it's a very gradual process whereby her work's being shown around, and she starts to get invited to show what she's doing in Boston. And so you don't actually see a lot of evidence of amazement. What you see is evidence of appreciation and an increasing ambition on her part, especially, and her poems start to be published. Then when they start to circulate outside of Boston, you start to see this kind of wow, this is really significant. This might mean something that has larger, possibly political implications, and that is something that she and that the Wheatleys are able to leverage really as a tool of a sign of progress and conversion. I think what we might call what some scholars call the amelioration of slavery. This idea that, okay, well, all right, slavery. They all know at some level that slavery in the British world has gotten bigger in the last generation, but maybe we can make it better if we convert people. Maybe it's not always going to keep getting worse. Maybe we are, and the same is true for, they're thinking in similar ways, especially evangelicals like the Wheatleys and George Whitefield. Well, George Whitefield in 1740 is saying very critical things about slavery, but then he's evangelizing in the South, and he basically says, the important thing is not whether slaves get freed or not. The important thing is that they get converted, and you treat them in a biblical way, which that'll be a big step forward for these folks. So they're not so focused on emancipation, but eventually Phillis is, and she uses this to get to London, get her poems published, and by the time that happens, the patriots are getting shamed for being hypocritical slave drivers, and she's able to use that. And in some of the reviews of her book, it's quite explicit. Like, who the hell? Like, can you believe these Americans? Like, I mean, even the one who says it most explicitly actually isn't even that willing to admit that she's a great poet. But suddenly, when he can throw it in the face of the Americans, she's impressive enough. There's just the fact that she's published the book and has written so many poems. This shows that there's something inconsistent about these people crying for liberty and holding other people slaves. So Wheatley becomes free as part of this process of conversation about Africans, natives, enslaved people, religion, which is impossible to separate from the conversation about British liberties and human liberties and natural rights.
Well, and someone who had a complicated reaction to her work is Thomas Jefferson. Can you share with us his thoughts?
Yeah, well, jumping ahead, Jefferson doesn't say anything until after she's gone. Yeah, she dies in 1784. But around that time, he is writing his notes on the state of Virginia, which include most famously some very racist passages about how about Africans that suggest that that if they become free, they can't ever be incorporated as full citizens. But he says that in another part of the notes, answering a different question from the French ambassador who has asked these series of questions about the different states and conditions there that he's responding to. He said that slavery is wrong and God's going to judge us. And so these two things, the like saying slavery needs to end, and we almost succeeded in ending it when we had some new laws, but it's not my fault that it didn't end. And but when we do end it, we can't have these people here. These two things that are very hard for us to imagine going together. This great contradiction. Wheatley's actually at the center of it, and Wheatley's at the center of it because she's been used against the Americans, and he is doing the whole thing is basically trying to make Virginia and America look good, so that the French will continue to support American independence, and you'll have good trade relations. And it basically, you can't. Notes on the State of Virginia is brilliant in so many ways, and it's very heartfelt. But it's also a work a work aimed at a European audience, trying to put the best possible face on the United States. And since it's Notes on the State of Virginia, it has to put the best possible face on slavery. But as part of his attempt to say, don't think of America as a land of slavery and as the opposite of enlightenment. Think of it as actually the place where, as the French like to think of it, as the place where maybe you can put the Enlightenment into practice better than you can in the old regime. What these examples of African genius, which have been used to say that really the only reason why that when Africans are treated better, they will become that they can become a nation unto their own, and that they deserve equal rights, as opposed to saying they deserve to be enslaved because they're heathens, or they're not equal, or they're different. He has to leans heavy on debunking these claims that have been made for Ignatius Sancho and other Africans who have written and published work. So there's a lot, as other scholars have pointed out, there's a lot at stake in this dissing of Wheatley that Jefferson does. And so I read it as actually, and I don't let Jefferson take over the story. To me, he's just another reader responding to Wheatley, but a revealing one. And actually, I think that there's a copy. I have the illustration. Actually, the library. It turns out that that there's some folks at the Library of Congress who don't think this is the right copy of Jefferson's notes, that has emendations in it, that has that are clearly somebody tracking her in the newspapers. It looks like I said this like 7 years ago in print, and now they're saying that now that my book's been in the news, they're saying, oh no, that's not Jefferson's handwriting. I think it's Jefferson's handwriting. I talked to people at the Jefferson paper. They thought it was plausible. Jefferson's tracking her well before in newspapers back in 1773, 1774, but he's not saying anything about it. He's mulling it over. I think he's been preparing this moment where he's going to say, she probably didn't even write these poems. They're not so great. Why is he doing that? Because she's become a poster child for anti-slavery and someone who can make the American Revolution look bad.
Now, in the book, too, you feature over a dozen previously anonymously attributed poems that you now credit Wheatley with. Can you tell us about the discovery of those works and how they fit into the work?
Yes, this was something that happened relatively late in my research, as I was very slowly going through the Boston and area newspapers, and looking for places looking at just trying to get context for what other poetry other people were writing, looking for anti-slavery and pro-slavery stuff, and looking for people she knew, and lots of other things. I noticed poems that just sounded so much like her, and I just kind of filed them away, and I said, like, oh, like maybe someone's imitating her, or or maybe there's a kind of this is interesting, right? And as I started to think about some of the word choices and some of the signatures of her verse that people have used to authenticate or argue for other poems being hers that weren't always accepted as hers, where the evidence was not completely clear. We didn't have a manuscript signed by her. They didn't appear in one of her books. I really thought that these poems were I thought there was a very, very good chance that they were hers. And so I did more reading on women writing poetry in the 18th century. And it's clear that she published poems without signing them. We know about several others. And most of the time when women published, it was anonymous in the 18th century. That was the norm for women's authorship generally, and especially for poems. And so I published an article in the journal Early American Literature where I make the case more explicitly about that this makes sense that she would do this, and it especially makes sense that she would publish these poems at this time, actually after her book was published. That she's trying some things out, she's taking some chances. Some of them are just kind of ones that she's just not that, they're local, they're more elegy. She's just not that worried about getting credit for it. That there are lots of reasons why she would have published anonymous poems. Can I prove them? No. I did count compare the use of certain words and phrases that she particularly likes, and compare how often they occur in the 57 poems that are canonized as hers, and how often they occur in these poems. And I have a table in the back. So scholars will have to decide whether they agree with me or not. Probably I'm partly right. It's just the nature of the thing. But probably there are others that I didn't find.
Well, but that's
what I think. So I'm glad. I was a little worried that this would become. I don't want it to take over the book. I think I've got a lot of other discoveries and a story to tell. So I try to I kind of weave it in there, but try to make it clear when I'm talking about ones that aren't necessarily accepted as hers. But I think it also, to me, it fits with the other evidence I have for what she's doing and when she's doing it, which is really the point of the whole book, that we need to look at the things she wrote as actions that happened at specific moments. So I write about her poems. Usually there's one in almost every chapter where I'm saying, okay, this is what's going on. She writes this poem at this moment. And so my attribution and my discussion of these poems isn't just to say, look, she wrote more poems. It's to say, look, she's writing these poems and they fit with what else we know about what's going on with her. And that's one of the reasons why we should actually read them and take them seriously.
Absolutely. Well, before I pass you over to Ryan, because the questions are starting to pour in, just was wondering if you can share with us, you mentioned other discoveries, what some of your favorite discoveries in the writing process were.
Oh, well, you hit some of them. I don't, in terms of the cohort, and the other poems,
or any lesser known figures you want to make sure.
Oh, okay. Well, this one is hard to shorthand, but I discovered that there's a guy named Lord Lyttelton, George Lyttelton. He was a friend of Alexander Pope and a major patron of British writers. And Wheatley meets him when she goes over to London. We knew that. She mentions it in the letter where one letter where she describes who she met in London. And but nobody's thought much about him because he dies, and he's just another lordly fellow. Well, if you actually read his poetry, pay attention to what he was doing. He was a patron of women poets and of a another guy who was James Woodhouse, who was um, a shoemaker and an ordinary guy who became very well known as a poet. And the first poem in her book, To Maecenas, which is a poem to a possible patron, scholars have published forever about have wondered for a long, long time, who is this? Who's she writing to? Is there one person who is who she's writing this poem to as someone who understands why it's so important for her, and that she's signaling she's participating in this tradition of writing in praise of patrons that goes all the way back. So I'm able to, I by looking at Lord Lyttelton's poems, like you can see that she is riffing on and modeling on poems that Lyttelton wrote to Pope, and that Horace wrote to Maecenas. And so she's very knowingly writing herself, like participating in this and riffing on this tradition of asking for help from patrons, which isn't to say that Lord Lyttelton is the only person she has in mind, but she writes this poem very late. It's probably the last one, to preface the volume. So it's another example of how calculating she is. She knows she's gonna, so she writes this poem, and then somebody takes her to go see Lord Lyttelton because she's written this poem. And the only reason we don't know this is because Lord Lyttelton dies suddenly 2 weeks later after she meets him. But in the London newspaper, there's this account of how she went to Lord Lyttelton, which is like saying, of course she went to Lord Lyttelton. All people who want to get a good blurb go to Lord Lyttelton. He's been doing this forever. He did this for Henry Fielding. He did this for James Thompson. He's the guy. He's the guy you want first on your subscription list. So that it's that kind of those kind of connections, trying to show these people who she got to know and who are basically the footprints of her life that help us explain this literary career that we could say didn't work, and that she didn't really have one as we think of a career. But there are no careers for poets in the 18th century, much less for enslaved ones. It's amazing that she did what she did.
And that we're still talking about her today.
We're talking about it, right.
Well, on that, I'm going to pass you over to Ryan. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Gina, and thank you, Professor, for that wonderful back and forth. It was great. This part of the program, as our audience knows, is the audience participation section, and we're going to begin with our History Scholar of the Week. And as our loyal listeners know, but those who might be new might not, each week, history students have an opportunity to submit a question to us, and the winning question will be selected, and it will be read aloud during the live program. And the History Scholar will receive a $50 gift card to our gift shop for themselves, but also for their teacher. So really a wonderful opportunity, and we encourage students to keep the good questions coming. And this week is no exception. It's not a Lord Lyttelton question, but equally as good. It is from Anas, an 8th grader from Stuyvesant High School in New York. And the question is, how strongly did white Europeans and white Americans believe that Phillis Wheatley was, quote, saved by Christianity?
Well, I've had, let me preface this first by saying it's great to have a Stuyvesant student. My grandfather went to Stuyvesant. I don't think anyone had any doubt. She demonstrated through her poetry and that she was Christian, and it was a theme of many of her poems. There from the beginning, so that it's impossible to separate that out. There were though moments where ministers tried to steer her in a more evangelical direction, as she branched out and was maybe not as pious in her poetry and in her persona. One of her allies, who was an important anti-slavery figure later, tried to, or two of them actually, tried to get her interested in going to Africa as an evangelist. And she said, "No, thanks. I'm not. They would find me to be a barbarian." She really, it's an amazing exchange of letters that I talk about.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that and for the question and for the answer. Sam asks, when I have tried to use Wheatley's poems, some students have responded negatively to the ways in which she apparently internalized and expressed racist ideas in her poems. So I've tried to use this as an opportunity to examine the process of internalized oppression in our own lives, and I've developed tools to help students reflect on this in our own lives. This discussion has been productive. But still, these students don't really like her poetry much for these ideological reasons. Can you address the role of internalized oppression in her life and work? And secondly, do you have any suggestions for how to address these issues productively with students?
This book really comes out of precisely those kind of classroom encounters, though I guess I should, but though from the beginning, I've been pushing back on the idea that she's mainly important as a negative example of internalized oppression. So that said, I don't think that's the right way to read her. I think she's at most she's kind of baiting. She's kind of making, especially in I'm sure you're thinking of On Being Brought from Africa to America. She's mocking the white audience. She's giving them what they want in order to turn it around and suggest that, well, actually, I can teach you things, and your racism is making it impossible for you to hear me, is what she's really doing in the last 4 lines of that poem. And so I think that, I mean, it's poetry. There's no one interpretation. It could be and people have read that poem that way. But I hope that you'll read the book, and maybe we'll be able to think together about bringing it back into the classroom, and whether that's possible, whether you can selectively use some of the context that I provided in order to say, well, if you know these things, and if you look at these poems, and if you know that there is an active conversation going on about what it means when enslaved people become Christian, and what it means that they can and do, and also particularly the way that the conversation that's in the backdrop of that poem is about Methodists mocking the excuses that some pious people are using, are saying that like there's already a conversation going on where some people are pushing back and saying, no, conversion does not justify the slave trade. Conversion does not even justify slavery. This conversation has been going on for a long time, but it's building up, and the very people that Wheatley is in conversation with and influenced by are at the forefront of that. So she's really setting them up. She's really setting up readers to sort of to catch them, to make them be able to look in the mirror and see their own the self-fulfilling prophecy that Christianity has sometimes been, where it has sometimes justified slavery, but it shouldn't. But it's that's what I think is going on. I'm just pushing one step further than some of the recent literary criticism has on that. But there is a long tradition of seeing her as kind of what we used to call an Oreo, as you know, and as too acculturated and as having nothing to say. I think that is a kind of really has been a male discourse where mostly Black male critics and artists have been talking back to the women who celebrated her for her achievement. And I that's what I get in the last chapter. I talk a little bit about that long history where African Americans kept her alive, but in the 20th century there started to be a kind of gender divide in terms of appreciating and criticizing her. And Black women writers and poets really started to bring her back in the 70s and 80s.
Fascinating. Just the historiography alone is fascinating. Susan asked if you could talk a little bit more about the Wheatley's reaction to her poetry and when she started to get more successful, and what was the Wheatley's reaction to this?
Well, it's clear they're very proud, and they are helping her market her poems, and in a pretty savvy way. It's hard to tell sometimes where their strategies start and end in relation to hers, but they have connections and are able to do things that she can't do alone, and that she finds it a lot harder to do once they're gone, which happens pretty quickly. Susanna Wheatley, who's really the key figure, is dying, is pretty much very sick when she's over in England, and dies not immediately. And it's often been said that she rushes back from London in order to take care of her, which she clearly does, but she doesn't die right away. So there's this really interesting period where this was exactly where I think she's actually publishing a bunch of poems anonymously. And I think some of them she's publishing because she's publishing them anonymously because she's not sure that Susanna would approve of them. That's another incentive she has to maybe do that. So I don't talk as much about that as you might think, because I'm a little bit wary or tired of the effect of the way that the question's sometimes been asked: how much control did she have over her own work? Right? It's kind of a metaphysics of suspicion. And like, I see all this clear pattern of her being very, very politic and crafty, and accomplishing amazing things by being indirect in ways that are exactly what we would expect from a woman and an enslaved person in a racist society. So she's being very, very careful. So to make the first question, does she have any control, as opposed to what is she able, where can we see her acting, is the kind of load the dice again, like, and then underestimate just how, like, so she, I mean, really, I mean, I'm not, you might not be able to understand everybody in her world the way I'm trying to understand her, but she is the person who is most successful, or remarkably successful, in using using the kind of strategies that she's using. So but clearly they must have been working together, and they're clearly very close. And Wheatley says famously said some very interesting things about how she was treated as a daughter when after Susanna Wheatley dies. And I take that very seriously, but we have to also understand that in the context of a family-based slavery, where basically the white people got to have these these people who were in the family but not of the family, who could be sold and were sold when needs or opportunities arrive or situations change. So it's still American slavery, but it's very, very familial, and both those things could be true. So that's like one of the constant themes. She's living under threat of sale. She's seeing other people sold, and yet she's also experiencing this kind of benevolence and being singled out and being treated remarkably well. And like, so it's not one or the other. It's not she's either really a slave or she's really not. She's actually maybe her experience of this kind of intimacy, and at the same time as being as being treated as being racialized and being treated as a servant, and as living under and not being able to have her own family, is really typical of slavery in the North, and really, in a larger sense, maybe slavery also in some of the other societies with slaves that she maybe knew in Africa. So
thank you. Thank you for that question and for that answer. Charles S., do you believe that Wheatley's famous 1775 poem in honor of George Washington's appointment as commander of the Continental Army may have influenced his thinking on race? And Charles points out that after receiving it, Washington announced that he would allow free blacks but not enslaved blacks to enlist in the Continental Army. He also invited Wheatley to visit him at headquarters and praised her as a genius. Years later, Washington would free the men and women he enslaved in as well. So an interesting question about the relationship between Washington and Wheatley.
Yeah, I'm glad that other scholars that this got more attention, and that Washington scholars like Henry Wiensek and others started to raise this issue. But I think that the way it's usually been discussed in a kind of yes or no way, and in a unidirectional way, like either he was influenced her or he wasn't, is actually too narrow, and it separates her from the political context, the immediate context, and also from the larger the Black communities she's part of. Actually, she's one of a number of Africans, including soldiers who are already in the army, who are pressuring Washington to maybe accept Black soldiers in the army, and he's kind of waffled on it, going back and forth, because there are different people in Continental Congress and in the army want to go in different ways with this, and should they recruit, or should they just accept the ones who are already there? And so he does change the policy, but it actually goes the other way. I argue he decides to change. She is trying to do diplomacy. She is trying to push the envelope and toward emancipation in writing this poem and in praising Washington. But he gets the letter and poem, and he ignores it for weeks and weeks. Then though he decides to change the policy. And then he writes her back saying, and he writes to Joseph Reed, and he sends the poem to his assistant, Joseph Reed, and says, get this into the newspaper. I just found it on my desk. It was buried on my desk. I just found it. And he writes back to her and says, you're wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I haven't published it, and I haven't, because everyone would think I was vain if I spread it around, but come visit me in Cambridge. So he knows exactly what she's doing. Poets write and praise great military men for their own purposes, and military men let it be known that that some people think they're great, and this is a time when there are people who think that somebody else should be the head general. This is all part of both Phillis Wheatley's PR and George Washington's PR, and they're playing a dance. So it's not just was he influenced, was he not? The really important thing about this is Phillis Wheatley is participating in Black politics in 1775, which is about, can they, what are the implications of their serving? What are the implications of Phillis Wheatley being recognized as a real poet? And where is this going to go? And what relationship will American victories have for the future of African people? And so I have a good part of a chapter, but he's not the only general that she writes to. It's almost hard to find a general that she knew or knew about that she didn't write about. And that's one of the reasons why I think that these poems that I found to General Gates and to John Hancock are also her, because she was doing stuff like this better than anybody else was, actually.
Fascinating symbiotic relationship there, for sure. Linda asked an interesting question. It seems, according to her, that Wheatley used the tenets of Christian faith similarly to how Frederick Douglass used the founding documents to create this unavoidable contradiction of belief and reality. To your knowledge, is it possible that, do you think Frederick Douglass was aware of, I'm sure he was aware of the writings of Phillis Wheatley, but did he ever reference them, or do we have any idea about what he thought, or maybe other Black leaders thought in the 19th or even early 20th century of her work?
Okay, two things. So Douglas and Douglas in particular, and others. Uh, well, Douglas used, I would say Douglas used Christianity in a similar. Douglas used the founding fathers and the revolution in a parallel way. That's a very interesting comparison. But he also used Christianity and shamed masters for being hypocrites as Christians, and you can see him doing that in the 1845 narrative and in his speeches. I have not. I probably should have asked David Blight and other Douglas and the Douglas papers folks whether they'd seen any references to Wheatley in Douglas. I haven't seen any in anything I've ever read, but the abolitionists by Douglas's time have already made a big deal out of her. In 1832, in the Liberator, they print all of her poems serially in 1832-33, and the Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper, does the same. I don't think they print all of them, but they print a bunch of them. So they are aware of, and like, there's not a lot of commentary on it, but it's clear that that there's an appreciation of her as a force for anti-slavery, both by her example and by some of and in some of the poems.
Fascinating. Thank you.
And that I think that continues, and that definitely continues into the 20th century.
Fascinating. Thank you. Robert and others asked, for those who might not know, can you talk a little bit about, was Phillis ever freed? What was that process?
Yeah, we didn't get to that.
Yeah, and we know that, or some of us might know that she has kind of a tragic, I want to call it later life, even though she only lives to be about 30 or something like that. So if you could talk about the quote unquote later years of her life a little bit.
We can say with confidence, because she says it and others say it, that going to London, getting her poems published, and folks saying that should free her, and that the Americans and her owners were hypocritical if they didn't free her, since she's so clearly such an accomplished person and a genius, that does lead to her being freed. Exactly how it happened, in what order, and how much of it was part of the design, whether the Wheatleys always intended it or they got shamed into it, whether she had it in mind or not, is less clear. And I have a chapter laying out some of the possible, I think 4 possible ways it may have played out based on the different. She says different things to different people about this, and that's why we can't know for sure. But looking at all the evidence, I think she kind of covers her tracks. I think she doesn't want. It's not clear what exactly emancipation is going to mean for her, and her book. She needs to keep selling her book to white people, and maybe that's going to be her nest egg. Then she's a refugee with other members of the Wheatley family. Susanna Wheatley dies, and when John Wheatley dies, she comes back to Boston. She's living in their house. John Wheatley dies. She's clearly free. John Wheatley dies, and then she gets married. It's wartime. John Peters, who she marries, is a very impressive guy, doing a lot. He's defending other Africans in court. He has a business. He's in a partnership with in various textiles and supplies. He then they go. Nina Dayton's research has shown that he almost inherits this farm that he grew up on, which they go live on it, and that kind of all falls apart, and then they come back to Boston, but it's wartime, and the economy was good when he was doing well, and then later on, when he's in debtor's prison, the economy is terrible, and we don't know that it seems as if that there is testimony that she was impoverished and her husband's in debtor's prison, and that one or more of her children may have died with her in depressing circumstances in 1784. That said, she's clearly writing more poems. She publishes very impressively two poems in 1784. She's still at the top of her game. I mean, to me, she's another. I mean, this is the age of like poets dying in garrets because they don't get paid. I mean, this is happening. I mean, they've been writing, the writers and poets have been writing about this for decades in England. It's like a stock in trade, like, the starving artist already. Like we can say she has a tragic end, but I think it underestimates what she accomplished and the fact that that a lot of people that she succeeded in getting free, in establishing her own family, and continuing to pursue her art. And it's not that uncommon to die of a disease, and she may have had a chronic disease. I mean, there's lots of testimony that she had asthma and she had chronic diseases, maybe from the Middle Passage, maybe from other factors. But she was not healthy, always healthy in her young life. She says this in letters to Obor Tanner, and there are other references to it. So we need to be careful before we say that she had that I think there's been a tendency to overemphasize her tragic ending and to say that if only she had been bolder, or if only she had like one great patron, something like that. I think that's maybe not the best way to make sense of her trajectory. That said, we know a lot less about those last 6 years than we know about the previous 6 to 10 years of her life.
Fascinating. And I'm going to pass it back to Gina in one moment, but just keeping an eye on time. If you have, and I hate to limit you, but in very quickly, and final thoughts about, specifically, we have a lot of teachers and students in the audience. How could they best use this work in the classroom? Is there a specific chapter that you would recommend, or a document that goes best with this work?
I haven't thought about it that way yet. And I've been teaching mostly graduate students in recent years, so I haven't been in the classroom with it, or talking to teachers the way I did after slavery's constitution. Did a lot of workshops with teachers. I do think that some of there are poems of hers that are best known for good reasons and that are most accessible, but maybe I'm hoping that my book will make some of her other lesser known ones more comprehensible, and also maybe make it possible to think of her as an artist who develops over time, and not just be looking for what did Phillis Wheatley think about slavery, or what did she think about the American Revolution, or what she really about any more than we would. I mean, like, of course we do that with any. We look at one, we figure them out, but I think it's truer to what she was doing and to the history to sort of think of it as a story and of her as evolving, because it's very clear that she becomes bolder and more anti-slavery and more able to be public in her criticisms of slavery and of the Americans over time, and that maybe we can find ways to leverage some of the other documents that I point to with some of her less well-known works to make it more of a story that is part of the American Revolution, as well as especially as part of African American history in that era.
Thank you so much, Gina. Back to you for some final thoughts. This was wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much. And we had a ton of questions that weren't able to be answered in the chat. And the best way to rectify that is you can purchase a copy of the book at bookshop.org. And the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And next week, we're thrilled to welcome the author of The Kennedy Withdrawal, Camelot, and the American Commitment to Vietnam. And there is so much Phillis Wheatley material on our website, including in the Hamilton Education Program. There's some great lesson plan ideas in there. So teachers out there, if you're looking for a nice sort of adjacent activity to the book, you can find them all there. Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an honor to have you here, as the chat emphasized. I think everyone really enjoyed today's session.
Will I be able? I hope I'm able to look at the chat and the questions that we didn't get to address.
We can download. We can absolutely share that with you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.